Great. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Damien Morris. I've just finished my PhD at King's College London. So this session is called Big Picture, and this talk, it doesn't get much bigger picture than this. I'm going to be spending my brief time with you today talking about free will, human agency, and personal responsibility, and discussing how these philosophical questions bear on how we do social and behavioral genetic research. This talk is based on an academic monograph that I wrote that's due to be published in Twin Research and Human Genetics. It's going to be spread across 3 issues. It's 50,000 words long, so I'm obviously only going to be able to tease you with a little part of it today, and hope it whets your appetite to read more when it comes out. But you might already be asking yourself, what has all of this got to do with me? I'm a scientist. I'm concerned with empirical questions, not these abstract philosophical questions. Well, it turns out it has quite a lot to do with us. The economist John Maynard Keynes famously noted, the ideas of philosophers, both when they are right and when they are wrong, are more powerful than is commonly understood. And practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influences are usually the slaves of some defunct philosopher. So I'm going to be spending this session talking to you about an incoherent view on the nature of free will that lurks in the background not just of social science genetics, but large swathes of the social sciences in general. And I'll be talking about how it can negatively impact empirical research in social and behavioral genetics by prejudicing us against genetic explanations for human behavior. This theory drives a culture of recrimination in which accusations of genetic determinism are regularly hurled at and sometimes by social and behavioral geneticists. It also fosters a climate which makes it difficult to conduct genetic research on social science outcomes by encouraging key gatekeepers to place additional barriers in the way of such research. Now, the philosopher Daniel Dennett has a wonderfully evocative quote which captures the key characteristics of this theory I want to talk about. He writes, "There is no more potent source of anxiety about free will than the image of the physical sciences engulfing our every deed, good and bad, in the acid broth of causal explanation, nibbling away at the soul until there is nothing left to praise or blame, to honor, respect, or love." Now, I love this phrase, the acid broth of causal explanation, because it captures the widespread anxiety that to the extent that science shows our behavior is caused by something outside of ourselves, that we cannot be held responsible for it. It also conveys how the threats to human agency are conceived as negatively, nibbling away at the soul until there's nothing left. So Dennett's quote thereby captures the central features of a theory of free-will-by-subtraction, that is pervasive across the behavioral sciences. A theory which suggests that the domain of human agency is whatever is left over after the measured causes of behavioral variation have been accounted for. Once you become sensitized to this theory of free will by subtraction, you begin to see it everywhere. It's implicit in the logic displayed across the social sciences that individuals are victims of circumstance to the extent that their behavior can be predicted by, statistically predicted by variables that are outside of their control, such as the socioeconomic conditions of the household that they were raised in. It's also pervasive in moral and political debates, where individuals are often regarded as less responsible for their socioeconomic outcomes, their health outcomes, or even the crimes they commit based on their childhood circumstances. And we've even seen some research on this kind of topic today. But the conspicuous feature of this free will by subtraction position is that beyond the social determinants of various life outcomes, individuals are assumed to remain responsible agents with power over their own life choices. These statistical intrusions on human agency are treated as limited exceptions to the general rule of human autonomy. But what's left unexplained here is how human agency is supposed to arise at all under a secular materialist framework in which all human behavior is ultimately assumed to have extrinsic causes, or why scientific knowledge of those extrinsic causes of human behavior should infringe upon our freedom more than causes that have not been identified. So increasingly in social science genetics, this same logic is being extended to genetic influences on human behavior and not just social determinants. So for example, in this paper, Rita Pereira explores how both childhood socioeconomic circumstances and genetic differences in ability can both be used as statistical measures of unfair sources of inequality. For her statistical analysis, she uses the EA3 PGS, but she recognizes that this is an incomplete measure of the full genetic influence on socioeconomic inequalities. Meanwhile, we have this study by Gretz et al. That compares sibling correlations for educational attainment across different countries. And in that, the authors defend the use of this genetically confounded measure of unequal opportunity by suggesting that the genetic advantages that siblings hold in common are another source of undeserved inequality. In fact, they note that by failing to capture the genetic advantages that make siblings different from each other, they're actually underestimating the full effects of family background on inequality. So, what these two studies have in common is the idea that there are unfair sources of inequality that are due to external genetic and environmental conditions, as opposed to fair sources of inequality that aren't due to extrinsic causes, but are instead a result of the agent's own actions. So that second clause should give you a moment's pause. In any case, the conclusion that both studies seem to be fumbling towards is that the correlation between monozygotic twins is the best measure of unequal opportunity, because it's an omnibus measure that captures all of the genetic influences and all of the shared environmental influences on a trait. In other words, the conclusion they seem to be reaching for is that the non-shared environmental variance, that is, the differences between identical twins reared together, is all that people can be held responsible for. Now, if that idea sounds familiar to you, it's because it was fully worked out by Eric Turkheimer, who has the dubious distinction of giving the world perhaps the most explicit presentation of the theory of free will by subtraction. His clearest formulation of this theory is in his 2011 paper, a comment piece called Genetics and Human Agency, and his theory was recently recapitulated by Paige Harden in her 2021 book, The Genetic Lottery. Turkheimer's theory stands behind Harden's point that your genotype, like the social class of your family, is an accident of birth over which you had no control and a source of luck in your life. In that 2011 paper, Turkheimer explicitly declares that the non-shared environment is free will. And he argues that we can claim this because the non-shared environment quantifies human agency as the variation in a given trait that remains after genetic effects and the effects of the family environment have been taken into account. He even goes on to argue that we can rank different behavioral traits according to their controllability and moral relevance. Weight more than height, personality more than intelligence, depression more than schizophrenia. Now, he doesn't say it in writing, but his table clearly leads us to the reader to draw the implication that we have more control, that we have more control over our sexual orientation than our criminal behavior. So, if you think something is starting to sound a bit wrong here, you should trust your instincts. It might be true that the non-shared environmental variance for sexual orientation is quite large, relatively large, but it doesn't mean I can control my sexual orientation or choose the kind of people that I'm sexually attracted to. Something is seriously awry here in how Turkheimer is conceiving the non-shared environment. Let's dig deeper. Why does Turkheimer think that the non-shared environment can measure human agency and the controllability of different traits? On the basis that we haven't identified the specific causes of non-shared environmental differences between siblings. And here he references a review he conducted with Mary Waldron, which found that the cumulative effects of measured shared environmental variables accounted for less than 3% of the variation in behavioral traits. So the logic here is that human beings can't be held responsible for their behavior when we can isolate the specific causes of their behavior. But of course, just because we haven't isolated the specific causes of someone's behavior doesn't mean that behavior wasn't caused. So let's recall how Plomin and Daniels first described the gloomy prospect that we might never isolate the specific causes of non-shared environmental variance. They write that the relevant environmental factors might be unsystematic, idiosyncratic, or serendipitous events. This is to say that the non-shared environment might consist of trillions of sliding doors moments, like catching or missing a particular train or looking left versus looking right, each of which drives our lives in subtly or dramatically different directions from our siblings, if we have any. So contrary to both Turkheimer and Harden, it's not just genetic and shared environmental influences which are a source of luck in our lives. Most of what we would ordinarily call dumb luck consists of non-shared environmental influences. Moreover, as Harden notes in an important footnote to the genetic lottery, the non-shared environment might substantially consist of random stochastic developmental differences between monozygotic twins, which they can hardly be held responsible for. So this is the basis of a significant intellectual rift between Harden and Turkheimer. It leads Harden to conclude that there's hardly any behavioral variation that isn't explained by extrinsic causes, leaving remarkably little territory for personal responsibility. And by contrast, Turkheimer is eager to carve out a much bigger space for human agency. In fact, Turkheimer goes in completely the opposite direction, extending the gloomy prospect to all sources of behavioral variation and arguing that it is only measured genetic and environmental causes of behavior that infringe our agency under any variance component. So I call this his gloomy prospect theory of free will, as opposed to his non-shared environmental theory of free will. So let's see how Turkheimer's two theories compare when looking at variation in violent criminal offending. This twin study in the Swedish registry reported heritability at 55%, shared environmental influence at 13%, and non-shared environmental influence at 32%. In these pie charts, I've used yellow thatching to shade out the variance that Turkheimer says we aren't responsible for under each of his two theories. So based on his non-shared environmental theory of free will, Swedes are responsible for less than 32% of the variation in their violent offending. Maybe we should cut the sentences of those violent criminals by 2/3. By contrast, when we look at his gloomy prospect theory of free will, we get to claw back control over most of the variation in violent offending, especially that big chunk that was attributed to the heritable variation. I guess we can keep those violent criminals locked up a little bit longer after all. But note something else. If the direct effects of polygenic scores come to explain more of the heritable variation over time, or if more of the shared and non-shared environmental sources of behavioral differences are identified, the degree of agency we have over criminal behavior will shrink accordingly. Now that doesn't sound right, does it? The level of agency we have over a particular trait shouldn't depend on how much we know or don't know about the causes of behavioral variation in that trait. So the philosophical mistake that Turkheimer is making here has been given several names, but the legal scholar Stephen Morse calls it the fundamental psycho-legal error. He explains it thus. Most of the time we possess only imperfect, partial understanding of the causes of behavior. It is important to remember, however, that not possessing knowledge of the complete causal account of a person's behavior does not mean that a complete causal account does not exist. If this is a universally caused or deterministic universe, all phenomena are caused, whether or not we have knowledge of those causes. And he continues, in a causally deterministic universe, all phenomena, including human actions, are fully caused. If causation were per se an excusing condition, no one could ever be responsible for anything. Thus, causation cannot be an excusing condition in law and morals, both of which hold some people responsible and excuse others. Essentially, in the academic discourse on free will, it's understood that you basically have two main options open to you. Either you believe that extrinsic causation of behavior is compatible with free will and that personal responsibility exists, or you believe that extrinsic causation of behavior is incompatible with free will and that personal responsibility does not exist. The first category are called compatibilists, second category are called hard incompatibilists. There is a third option, which argues that human behavior is only partially due to extrinsic causes, which is called libertarian incompatibilism. But that's essentially a supernatural and dualistic view of human agency, which posits that human beings have an immaterial soul and that every time we make a decision, a miracle occurs that allows us to break the laws of causation that govern the material world. It should go without saying that allowing for supernatural agent causation in our scientific conception of human behavior is a pretty unusual way to go about the secular enterprise of conducting behavioral science. Turkheimer's notion that scientifically unexplained variation in behavior is a yardstick of human agency perfectly maps on to this supernatural theory of free will, because it would suggest that the reason we haven't identified some of the causes of our behavior is because there are none, because some of our behavior is miraculously self-caused. There's just one problem. Turkheimer explicitly rejects the supernatural worldview and rejects the view that our unexplained behavior is uncaused. Right after he introduces this idea that the non-shared environment is free will, he states, not the kind of metaphysical free will that no one believes in anymore, according to which human souls float free above the mechanistic constraints of the physical world. And in the Turkheimer and Waldron review, he concedes that something about the environment must be causing differences among genetically related siblings reared together. So how does he square this circle? I put it to you that he cannot. Perhaps you've seen this meme before. The joke is you can pick any two in your romantic partner: physical attractiveness, intelligence, or emotional stability. You can't have all three. A similar trilemma confronts us in the free will debate. We can only coherently hold two of the following three positions simultaneously. A, that human agency and personal responsibility exist. B, that all human behavior has extrinsic causes. And C, that human agency is incompatible with extrinsic causation. Compatibilism holds that A and B are true. Hard incompatibilism holds that B and C are true. And libertarian incompatibilism holds that A and C are true. By trying to support all three positions at the same time, Turkheimer places himself in an impossible philosophical bind. He wants to be a libertarian incompatibilist, but he also wants to support a secular materialist worldview in which all human behavior, like all other natural phenomena, has extrinsic secular causes. This drives him to support an indefensible position, the position that extrinsic causes only infringe upon our free will to the extent that we know about them, a kind of see no evil theory of free will. I would talk you through this excellent tweet which displays this logic, but I don't have time. Yeah, that's basically all I have time to discuss today, but I invite you to read the full piece when it comes out. I just want to leave you with one final thought, that genetic determinism is essentially a non-problem in academic philosophy. Most non-religious philosophers agree that all human behavior has extrinsic secular causes, and the question of whether we have responsibility for our behavior doesn't hinge on the question of whether those causes are genetic or environmental. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. And we have time for one question.
It's a little bit of a comment and a question. So that was a very interesting talk. I going back to my first year of grad school and thinking about, I'm a clinical psychologist, and we pretty much talked about, if we had all the data, we could predict everyone's behavior perfectly, which would, it seems like, align with, two of those three sort of poles that you just described. I am curious if you've seen differences in disciplines in the way that they approach free will and how they sort of deal with this. Again, I'm a clinical psychologist, so to me, I just kind of put it all aside and I say, well, who can I treat and how can I improve outcomes? I don't worry about free will. Like, it's just, it's extrinsic to what I need to deal with. So I'm just curious if that disciplinary approach, you've seen it different in different areas.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I can only say anecdotally, I haven't looked at data on differences across different fields. I think in the biosocial sciences, especially in like neuroscience, you get a lot of hard incompatibilists, and this has been bemoaned by. There's a very prominent compatibilist philosopher, just a very prominent philosopher in the free will debate. Unfortunately, Daniel Dennett has passed; he's no longer with us. But the biggest philosopher in that area is probably a guy called John Martin Fisher at the moment. A lot of you will be aware a book by Robert Sapolsky came out a little while ago called Determined, I think it was. But he was basically pushing this hard incompatibilist view. And John Martin Fisher wrote a review in this prominent philosophical review publication, basically bemoaning the fact that behavioral scientists, and especially neuroscientists, they stop at the question of whether our behavior is extrinsically caused or not, and they automatically leap from all of the piling up evidence that this causes this increment of behavioral variation, that they stop the argument at the question of extrinsic causation and don't even really begin to ask the philosophical questions about whether that impacts your free will or not. So I would anecdotally suggest that neuroscience is probably where you get the highest representation of hard incompatibilists. But I actually think across the behavioral sciences, both varieties of incompatibilism are massively overrepresented compared to the philosophical community. And if I could just skip ahead to a slide just to show you what the ratios are amongst non-religious philosophers. 68% of philosophers are compatibilists that don't believe that extrinsic causation infringes on your free will. I've actually covered up the number there, but it's less than 8% are libertarian incompatibilists, and that is the dominant view that we are hearing from Hardin, Turkheimer, and also Kevin Mitchell gives a variety of libertarian incompatibilism with a quantum spin.
Thank you. And that concludes our session in the afternoon. So we will come back in 15 minutes for our keynote talk. Thank you again to all the speakers, and make sure to talk to them if you have additional questions. So see you around.